Well, good morning again, and thank you so much for joining us as we celebrate Christmas together. This is the most wonderful time of year. I love Christmas. I know many of you do too. We've been celebrating for a month now. We've been working our way through a teaching series called Twas the Night Before Christmas. And as we get closer and closer to Christmas Day, we're preparing our hearts and looking at the things that can distract us from the significance of this Christmas season that we celebrate. And we've already talked about several different things that could distract us, things like hopelessness. And today we're going to talk about busyness, because busyness is very real most of the year, but especially this time of year. The more excited we get about the celebration of Christmas, the more we try to pack into just a few short weeks. Does anyone else try to squeeze as much into the Christmas celebration as possible? I do. I mean, there's on top of an already busy schedule, because the work week doesn't stop just because it's Christmas, does it? And so we start adding things. Like the last couple of weeks, we've had family come into town from the north and from the south, and we've spent so much time with family, and I love it. I love getting to spend time and celebrate Christmas with as many people as possible. There's Christmas parties. Anyone like a good Christmas party? You don't even have to like the people you're with, right? It's just the fact that you're together, it's a party, and it's Christmas. It's so much fun. There's gift exchanges, and if with gift exchanges there comes shopping, and a lot of shopping. We were at the mall yesterday trying to grab a few last-minute things for Christmas, and we could not find a space. Malls are dead most of the year, but at Christmas they are packed. I mean, there's Christmas traditions, there's Christmas lights, Christmas decorations, Christmas shopping, Christmas baking. Anyone a big baker? Not me. You lost me there. I do everything else. And I just try to squeeze as much as I can, though. And what I find, though, is the shorter the days get between now and Christmas, the shorter the time gets, the busier the day gets. And the busier I get, maybe the busier you get, the more likely we are to drop the ball on some things that matter most. We get so excited, and so many things we're excited about are good things and exciting things. And as they're about the celebration of Christmas, we're so much anxious anticipation for what's to come. We get fully involved and fully invested, and before you know it, we've accidentally dropped the ball on things that matter most. That's been my experience this Christmas, and most Christmases. Perhaps you have a similar experience. A lot of busyness around Christmas. If we were honest, though, we're not the only people that struggle with busyness when it comes to Christmas. We're looking back in time that 'twas the night before Christmas, and not the night before Christmas last year or the year before, a few years ago when we were younger. We're looking all the way back in time. 'Twas the night before Christmas, the night before the very first Christmas. And in their context, what was it like? What was life like? What was their life and their experience like the night before Jesus came? We've looked at Jerusalem, and we looked at the city of Rome. Today, we're going to look at the city of Bethlehem, because the city of Bethlehem nearly 2,000 years ago was so busy that they almost missed Christmas. If you have a Bible, we're going to read from Luke chapter 2. It's a very familiar Christmas story, and we're going to read quite a bit from Luke chapter 2 this morning. The very beginning is going to give us some much needed context, and we'll draw application from the latter part of the first section. Luke chapter 2, if you have a Bible, the words are going to be on the screen, but follow along with me as I read this familiar story. Luke writes, "In those days a decree went out from Caesar Augustus that all the world should be registered. This was the first registration when Quirinius was governor of Syria, and all went to be registered, each to his own town." And so we understand, because we've read the story so many times, that Caesar Augustus, if we just from the Bible and from history, he rose to power very quickly. And when his uncle was assassinated, he became Caesar. And he was the first leader of Rome, the first Caesar to have almost complete autonomy. The Senate was fully in support. They gave him all power, and the city and the city of Rome and then the nation of Rome basically worshipped him as a god. And he was not only a powerful leader and ruler of the world at that time, he was a master organizer. And so when Caesar Augustus came to power, he issued this decree that a census should be taken. And he wanted all people from all over the Roman world, much of the world, to travel back to where they were born or to their hometown to be registered. So when he went to issue taxes, he would know who people were and where they were so they could collect taxes. Not so different from what we do today. We go about census a little differently, but we do the same thing for the sake of population control and understanding and taxation. And so it wasn't just a quick census. Sometimes I think we read it like just one day Caesar Augustus issued a decree and very quickly it was over. But this would have been a process that took many years and covered all of the world. not the least of which were Joseph and Mary. In fact, in verse 4 we read, "So Joseph also went up from Galilee, the town of Nazareth, to Bethlehem, to the city of David, which is called Judea, Bethlehem. All right, because he was of the house and lineage of David. And he went there to be registered with Mary, his betrothed, who was with child. And while they were there, the time came for her to give birth. And she gave birth to her firstborn son, and wrapped him in swaddling cloths, and laid him in a manger, because there was no place for them in the inn." It's such a familiar story. And in fact, I'm afraid that sometimes we can't read this story without a sentimental but almost a callous approach, because we've been reading the same story surrounding Christmas for nearly or more than 2,000 years. And every time Christmas rolls around, we open our Bibles in Luke chapter 2, and we read the same words over and over. It almost becomes monotonous. And maybe we read Luke chapter 2, and we can almost hear the voice of Linus from Charlie Brown Christmas Story in the back of our head, because the story has been told and told and told, and rightfully so, because it is the greatest story. But at the same time, if we were to step back from the 21st century American Christian reading of the Christmas story and kind of ask some questions, what was life like in Bethlehem 2,000 plus years ago when Jesus was born? What was the city like? We would understand some things like the city of Bethlehem was only about 500 people. You know, we think of this massive city, but it really wasn't. It was a small, seemingly insignificant town, about 500 people living on about 3 miles outside of Jerusalem. And the census was probably the most exciting thing that had taken place there in a very, very long time. King David had been born there, but other than that, they didn't really have much claim to fame. And so as all the family traveled back to Bethlehem, the city of about 500 people would overflow. The population would overflow. If you're trying to think of like a visual for it, maybe you think Daytona Beach at Bike Week. You ever try to go to Daytona Beach at Bike Week? The city's a little bit bigger than Bethlehem, but when the bikers all show up, there's never a place to stay. The campgrounds are full, the hotels are full, bikes are everywhere. It's just teeming with people. That's what it would have been like in Bethlehem. Maybe you think New York City the week around Christmas and New Year. There's no room. In fact, I tried to plan a quick surprise trip to take Carissa to New York to see all the Christmas decorations the week after Christmas, and I could not find a hotel room. And it's not Bethlehem, is it? It's huge. But the few rooms I could find, I certainly couldn't afford, because there's so many people going to see what's going on. So was the city of Bethlehem. It was teeming with people. People from all around the area coming back to be registered. The merchants and the people running shops and carpentry shops and things like that, they would certainly be there and set up in full force trying to make money while people were there. And there was just so much going on and so many people, and they're so busy that they missed a virgin coming into town riding a donkey, pregnant with the Son of God. And she just wasn't another virgin, but her husband-to-be was from the city of Bethlehem. He would have had family there, and yet still she couldn't find any place to stay. And again, we think of Bethlehem kind of through our 21st century lens, and we think of a Motel 6 on one corner and a Hampton Inn on another corner, but they probably didn't have any inns. I mean, it says inn, but the word could be translated a upper room or a guest room. The inns were a Roman invention, and so Bethlehem probably didn't have a lot of hotels for people to stay at. So even in this town where she was, where her husband was from, she couldn't even find a family member with enough space in an upper room to squeeze her in. And so they put her out in a manger behind the house, or on the first layer of the house where the animals were kept and huddled together, and she gave birth to the Son of God in a manger with no one else around except for some animals. And we read that story and we think about that story, maybe through a fresh perspective. We look at the story and we think, how could they possibly get so busy as to miss something so significant that God was doing among them? But I wonder, if we were honest with ourselves, how many of us fill our calendars so full that we get too busy to see what God is doing? Because I think much like the city of Bethlehem, our busyness can blind us to the presence of God in our life. And our busyness can blind us to what God is trying to do in and around us. He wants to do something miraculous around us or in us, and we're so busy with things like family or shopping and good things, things that are important. that we overlook what God is trying to do. And much like Bethlehem, the night before the very first Christmas, we're blind to the miraculous movement of God in our life. So we're going to ask the question, how do we avoid being that busy? We don't want to give up time with family, and we don't want to not shop for gifts, and we don't want to not spend time doing things with family and friends and loved ones and celebrating Christmas. But how do we create just enough margin in our life, enough space in our life to experience what God is trying to do? For the answer to that question, we're going to look at another group of people that were not in the hustle and bustle of the city of Bethlehem. The city of Bethlehem was buzzing and people were all around. Family reunions were taking place. There was no room to see or experience what God was doing. But on the outskirts of town, there was another group of people with much more time on their hands, with a quieter life and space to hear exactly what God had to say. As we continue reading the story in Luke chapter 2, verse 8, we're introduced to a group of shepherds. And Luke introduces us this way. He says, in the same region, there were shepherds out in the field keeping watch over their flock by night. An angel of the Lord appeared to them, and the glory of the Lord shone around them, and they were filled with great fear. It says, and the angel said to them, fear not, for behold, I bring you good news of great joy that will be for all the people. For unto you is born this day in the city of David a Savior, who is Christ the Lord. And this will be a sign to you. You will find a baby wrapped in swaddling cloths and lying in a manger. Suddenly there was with the angel a multitude of heavenly hosts, praising God and saying, glory to God in the highest, and on earth peace among those with whom he is well pleased. And so out in the fields, outside of the hustle and bustle of the city, is a group of shepherds, and they're watching over their flocks, and their occupation kept them outside of the city. And that's the group that God sent the messengers to reveal the most exciting announcement that the prophecies have been fulfilled, that the Savior had been born just inside the city limits. Why would God choose to reveal this incredible news, this historic event, to a group of shepherds? Because again, if we kind of peel back the layers, the shepherds were not the most well-liked people in the culture. They were not the people you would invite over for dinner for several reasons. First of all, they were usually younger. They usually had no family. They had nothing to hold them down, and they were just trying to get by, so they were known for being a little bit dishonest. They would steal things, or the shepherds watched their flock so other shepherds wouldn't come and steal their sheep. It wasn't exactly the friendliest, most most friendly group with the highest integrity. They spent most of their time with sheep, so they kind of started to smell like sheep. Their social skills probably weren't the best because they spent time with sheep and other shepherds. And yet God still chose to reveal himself and his message to the shepherds because they had created the space to hear from God. In fact, if you're taking notes on your bulletin, the first thing we see is they were in a place to hear from God. For whatever reason, they were on the outskirts of town, whether it was by choice, whether it was just because that's where their job required them to be. Instead of the hustle and bustle of the city limits, they were out under the stars, the quiet hours of night, with just listening and watching the sheep. And so God chose to reveal himself to them because they were in a place to hear from God. Inside the city, there was too much going on. God was right there, Jesus was there, and yet they could not hear from him the exciting thing that was taking place. And I wonder, if we think of our life, how often do we get to a place where we can hear from God? How often do we move ourselves into a place where we can hear from God? And as I was thinking through that, I think sometimes it's a little difficult to step away and hear from God. And much more not practical, but a much more easy to understand idea. Carissa and I get terrible cell phone service, actually in much of the land. But the worst place in all of the land that we get cell phone service, or the lack thereof, is in our own house. And it is so inconvenient when you can't even make a phone call from your house. That's where we spend the majority of our time. Obviously, the most hours are spent in our house, and we can't make a phone call very often. And when someone calls us, we can't hear them on the other end. It's frustrating to us, and it's frustrating to them. And so we've identified in our house like two different areas that you can hear someone on the other end. It's on the very right side of our couch, the far right cushion. If you sit on that spot in our living room, more or less you can hear the person on the other end. The other option is outside the front door. Those two options are like the only place you can go to hear from God. That's it. And if you want to hear from God, you're going to have to come sit on our couch. It's the only place. It's the only place we can hear the person on the other end of the phone. And I was thinking about it. I was thinking about how practical that is, because when someone calls, we have to, while their name and their picture is up on the phone, we have to rush to the place where we can hear. We answer the phone there. When Carissa's leaving work, coming back from Daytona, and she calls, I know by the time she calls, I'll try to make my way to that portion of the couch. Unless the dog's being annoying, then I'll go outside and I wait for her call. The same thing is true of God. There's certain areas, there's certain places where we need to get to outside of the busyness, outside of the poor service, where there's too much interruption, to hear from Him. And that place might be different for you. Maybe for you it's outside. For me, I love to be outside of buildings, and I just spend time in nature. There's nothing but me and the Bible, so I can listen to what God has to say. Maybe for you it's somewhere else, a prayer closet, or a place, a room, an office, a space where no one else bothers you, and you just need to get away and create the space to hear what God has to say. Whatever it is, it's got to be intentional. We have to move ourselves to where we're in a good place to hear from Him, because there's so much going on and there's so much trying to distract us. And if we just go with the flow of culture, we will find ourselves so busy that we don't have the space to hear from God. In fact, culture celebrates our busyness. I read an article a couple years ago from the New York Times, and it talked about this idea of how busy we are. And if you would put it up on the screen, I'd like to share just a few parts with you. The writer in the New York Times said, "Busyness serves as a kind of hedge against emptiness. Obviously, your life cannot possibly be silly or trivial or meaningless if you are so busy. So completely booked, in demand every hour of the day. We're busy because of our own ambition or drive or anxiety, because we're addicted to busyness and dread what we might have to face in its absence." As I read that, and I kind of thought through the shepherds on the outside of town, I realized that we're just as guilty as the people in Bethlehem. We try to fill our lives with as much busyness as we can, because it kind of serves as a hedge of protection around the idea that there may be some emptiness, there may be some void in our life where we're looking for something to fill it. We don't know what to fill it with, and we haven't given the time to let God fill it for us. And so we just look for things to fill our lives, to take our time. We surround ourselves with work. And maybe it's you want to work and work and work and work, and you're not even producing the fruit you want to produce. But when you're at work, you don't have to think about other things. You don't have to think about the problems at home or the lack of intimacy with God, and so you go to work. Maybe it's a hobby. You spend all day on the golf course, or I'm not going to talk about fishing because that'll be too close to home, or maybe with some friends or something like that, and you spend too much time doing that because you don't want, and you keep yourself busy because you don't want to have to deal with the emptiness that may be underneath. For much of our country, it's watching movies. Did you realize that Netflix just recently released a year-end report that said around the world, people watch through their video streaming service 140 million hours of videos every day. That's just on Netflix. That's not considering YouTube or other channels or live TV. On Netflix, around the world, people consume 140 million hours of movies. If you add that up, that's about 1 billion hours a week of movies. And we do it for a lot of reasons. It's fun, it's time away, it's a way to escape reality, or maybe it's just a way to fill time. And especially when emotions and things start working themselves up, we want to look for something to escape our reality. And Christmas is a celebration. It's a celebration of Jesus, but Christmas is also a time that brings a lot of memories up. And sometimes Christmas is one of the most lonely times for certain people because of certain things you've experienced. And so Christmas time, maybe you go to movies to escape. And Netflix, they tweeted something that really caught my attention this week. Go ahead and put it up on the screen. Netflix tweeted this. They said the 53 people, they looked at all the world, the 53 people who watched the movie A Christmas Prince. That's their new Christmas romantic movie. Every day for the last 18 days, who hurt you? I thought, first of all, that's kind of a good way to lose 53 loyal customers, right? They're on your service every day for 18 days. But this romantic movie, I haven't seen that one yet, but I'll probably watch it because Carissa will want to. But this romantic movie that they released around Christmas, someone's, about 53 people, every day for 18 days, watched this movie. And Netflix realized and just flat out called us out They said, who hurt you? They realized there must be something going on if you're going to watch the same movie over and over and over again for such a period of time, or for such a long time. They're trying to escape reality. But the question then really is, what would it take to step away and spend time with God? Because if the busyness blinds us to the movement of God in our life, if the busyness blinds us from the work of God in our life, what is it going to take for us to find that place, even if it's just a short period of time, to build space into our life so we can experience God? And ask yourself in your life, in your context. It's not really a hypothetical question. For me, I found that there's several things that I really value, things that I want to prioritize in my life. The first, of course, is spending time with God. I want every day to have time carved out where I can just sit down with my coffee, because you can't talk to God without coffee, right? Coffee and a Bible, and listen to what God has to say, to read His Word, to let Him speak to my life and direct me as I follow Him. The other thing I've really prioritized this last year is getting in shape physically, and so working out. And I find that these two things that I really enjoy, that I really want to prioritize throughout the day, if I don't set time aside for them, the day will begin, the busyness will start, and the day will end, and I'll be too tired to open my Bible. I'll be too tired to go work out. And so I begin to carve out time first thing in the morning. I'm trying to get up earlier and earlier so I can have some coffee and I can spend time with God in the quietness of the morning when there's nothing to distract me. I'll get ready after that and I'll go to the gym and I'll work out and I'll come back and I'll get started with the workday. Because if I don't carve out the time, it just won't happen. Where is that time for you? If you're a morning person, maybe it's getting up a little bit earlier and spending time with the Bible. Maybe it's the only time you can find is a lunch break. And you always look forward to getting away from work and going out to lunch, but you could use that time instead. You could bring your lunch and spend time with God. Maybe it's after you put the kids to bed. It's the only time you find yourself with enough quiet space to spend with Him. Where is the time? Where are you going to find the time to spend time with God? Because the truth is, whenever we spend time with God, He always shows up. Whenever we carve out the time, God's going to be there. And He wants nothing more than the opportunity to speak with us and to do life with us. In fact, James, the brother of Jesus, said in James chapter 4, this famous phrase, go up on the screen, draw near to God, and He what? Will draw near to you. I love it. It's such a short little promise, but James buries it in his letter, and he writes to the Christians, if we draw near to God, God will draw near to us. It doesn't say if we carve out time for God, we hope that He's going to be on the other end. We're not going to say if we carve out time for God, if we get to the right space in the right place, that we hope He has good service. God's always going to be there when we draw near to Him. Draw near to God, and He will draw near to you. Jesus talked about prayer in the Sermon on the Mount, Matthew chapter 7, and He said this. He said, ask, and it what? Will be given to you. Seek and you will find. Knock and the door will be open to you. Ask and it will be given to you. Seek and you'll find. Knock and the door will be open to you. The next verse He says this. He says, for everyone who asks receives. The one who seeks finds. The one who knocks, it will be open. God always shows up. He always shows up. He's always there. He's always looking for us. We're the ones that find ourselves too busy to listen to Him. In fact, when we look at the story of the shepherds, we see God showed up just because they had the space. And as the story started, there was one angel, and the angel showed up and began to explain to them this good news. And the longer they listened to God, speak to them through this angel, the more miraculous it got. Right? The angel showed up, and the glory of the Lord showed around them, and that was impressive enough. But the more they listened, He gave them the message from God that Jesus had been born not far from where they were. And the longer they listened, suddenly a whole host of heavenly angels showed up and began speaking and singing and praising God right in front of them. I think that principle is so true in our life. The longer we spend listening to God, the greater the impact He'll make in our life. He always shows up, and it's always greater than we understand. So the angels appeared, the God spoke to the shepherds because they were in a place to hear from God. The second principle we learn from them is they were willing to act on what God told them. The shepherds were in a place to hear from God. God sent the angels. They gave them the good news. A heavenly host of angels showed up and began singing and praising God around them. And then we read, when the angels went away from them into heaven, the shepherds said to one another, let us go over to Bethlehem and see this thing that has happened, which the Lord has made us known. When the angels left, the shepherds go back to watching the sheep? No, not at all, right? They just see this impressive thing. They experience God, and so what do? They begin to act. They said, let us get up from here and go to Bethlehem and see what God has done. Verse 16 says, and they went with haste. In my Bible, I've circled the word went with haste. They hurried off and found Mary and Joseph and the baby lying in the manger. The shepherds experienced Jesus because they had the space to hear from God, and they were willing to act when God called them. Whenever we experience God, we should expect him to motivate us to respond. He doesn't speak to us just for the sake of speaking to us, right? Made in his image, we don't like to talk just for the sake of hearing ourselves talk. I mean, with few exceptions, right, ladies? We don't like to talk just to hear ourselves talk. God wants to see us move when he speaks to us. He wants to see us get up, and he wants to see us change. And the way the Bible says, he wants to see us transformed. No matter how long we walk with God, no matter how many times we've read the Christmas story, no matter how many times we've sought him through his word, he wants to see a transformation constantly taking place in our lives. He wants to see us get up and move. In fact, James, again, the brother of Jesus, talked about this exact principle in James chapter 1, verse 22. He says, but be doers of the word and not what? Hearers only. He says, don't just listen to the word. Don't just go to church on Sunday and listen to the word. Don't just open the Bible and just listen to what God has to say. Instead, do what it says. Otherwise, he says, you're deceiving yourself. For if anyone is a hearer of the word and not a doer, he is like a man who looks intently at his natural face in the mirror. Does anyone look at their face in the mirror before you go to work? And before you leave for the day? I mean, middle and high school students, probably not. But, you want to look good before you leave the house, right? Looks intently at his face in the mirror. For he looks at himself and goes away at once, forgets what he looks like. How pointless would it be to be getting ready at some state of preparation? You look at yourself in the mirror, you see your hair's not brushed, and you go on about your business and just leave the house and walk out and look like a moron. You wouldn't want to do that, would you? What do? When you look in the mirror, I only say that from experience. I've done it before. You want to button the buttons, you want to brush the hair, you want a change to take place when you look at yourself in the mirror. James says the same thing is true when we look into the Word. When we seek God through his word, when we spend time praying with him. In fact, he says, the one who looks into the perfect law, the law of liberty, and perseveres, being no hearer who forgets, but a doer who acts, he will be blessed in his doing. He will be blessed in his doing. God wants to bless us as we seek him. Just so often we find ourselves too busy to seek him. Think about the group of shepherds out in the field, no idea that God was about to pour out an abundant blessing on their lives. No idea that they were about to be included in a story that would be read for 2,000 years when we talk about the Savior. No idea that in the 21st century, all around the world, as people gather together, they will be reading the story of the shepherds. We went to the candlelight processional at Epcot this week. It's the first time I've ever experienced it before our passes blacked out. We wanted to go and see it, and Trace Atkins, the country music singer, was there. That was kind of cool, but he was reading the Christmas story. And he was in a group of people, thousands of people gathered around, and in between the music, he would read the story. And as he was making his way through the story, I was just thinking through the words that I've read so many times. And with this sermon in mind, he got to a place where he talked about the shepherds. I thought these shepherds had no idea that someday at Epcot, in Orlando, Florida, there would be people gathered around to hear what they experienced that first Christmas. God wants to bless us when we look into his law, when we draw close to him. But we have to create the space. So they responded. They were in a place to hear from God. They were willing to act on what God had said. And we see them motivated to respond in two different ways. The first way is this. They were motivated to tell others what God had done. They were motivated to tell others what God had done. It says in verse 17, when they saw it, they made known the saying that had been told them concerning this child. And all who heard it wondered at what the shepherds told them. So the shepherds heard from God, and they went and they saw that God had done exactly what God said he had done. They found it exactly as he said they would find it. And they went away and they began telling everyone else, wouldn't you, all that they experienced. When God touches our lives today, when we experience the significance of Christmas, the birth of Jesus, we can't help but tell other people what God has done. And we make it so difficult on ourselves, and we think we've got to work so hard and we've got to have the right words. These shepherds were probably not very well educated. They certainly didn't have the right words. They just went and told people what they had experienced God do. I don't think there's anything greater we can do for God than tell others about the story of what God has done for us. And Christmas is the perfect time because people are looking. Next week, we're going to celebrate Christmas Eve. And you'll be amazed at how many people will be open to an invitation to join you at church on Christmas Eve that wouldn't even consider it the rest of the year. So take an invite card. They're on the table in the back, and invite somebody in your circle this week, somebody at work, somebody that's recently lost a loved one that you know they're experiencing heartache this Christmas, and they're maybe streaming a movie 18 days in a row because they can't handle the burden. Invite them to worship with us so they can experience God filling that void maybe for the first time. But when we were motivated to tell others what God had done, and finally, they were motivated to worship. Verse 19, Mary treasured up all these things, pondering them in her heart. The shepherds returned, glorifying and praising God for all they had heard and seen, and it had been told of them. The shepherds were probably the first people to experience a transformation story when they met Jesus. Jesus, this little baby, they were out in the field and had no idea what God was about to do, and the angels show up and tell them to go and see Jesus, and they're already amazed, and they go into town and they see Jesus and this baby lying in a manger. And we don't know what they were doing while they were out in the field, but a bunch of ragtag group of guys, your guess is as good as mine, I bet they probably weren't worshiping. Right? They probably weren't singing Christmas songs. They probably weren't praising God. They were probably up to no good or not much going on out in the field. But when they return after they experience Jesus, they're worshiping. They're praising God. These people might not have set foot in the temple for who knows how long. But when they go back to the field, when they go back to the space where they were after experiencing Jesus, they go back with a heart of worship. When we experience Jesus this Christmas, it should motivate us to worship, and it does. It does. You can't experience Jesus and just go about your business. We start to tell other people what God has done, and we begin to worship. And I mean like really worship, not just show up and sing the songs we sang last year, the last time you were in church. No, we like really worship. We spend time in our car praying and asking God to do something in our life because of what we've experienced. We gather in our community groups and we just have a fun time and celebrate Christmas. But man, there is a heart of worship when God's people gather together. We come together and each and every week and we sing these songs and we lift God up and we humble ourselves because of what He has done. The question I want us to walk away with today is this: how would this Christmas be different if we intentionally made space to encounter Jesus? If we turned off the movie one day a week, if we spent one less hour preparing and we just encountered Jesus, how would this Christmas look different than all the other Christmases if we did something different? If we didn't let ourselves be so busy, if we didn't fill up our calendar so full that we had no room for Jesus, we were so exhausted at the end of the day, how would this Christmas be different if we intentionally made space to encounter Jesus? What I know for sure is that when we make space for Him, He shows up for us.